introduce yourself and about your session. So although it says jiving Power Automate with a SQL, so yeah, let's hear from you directly. So that's what
Awesome.
they.
Hi, my name is Ted. I think of the folks on this call, I work with Sumit and Samreen and Sharad the most, working on a number of projects, all kind of based on the Power Platform. And I tend to get involved when there's data involved. So my expertise started by working in data even before the Power Platform existed. And one of the things that I've found is that, hey, the two married together really do work very, very well together in a sense. So what I wanted to do was give you guys kind of part of this is a generic, the Microsoft, hey, this is what Power Automate does. So you guys kind of know when Microsoft comes to the table, they say this, and then kind of give you some of the tips and tricks that I've learned in working with the platform. It is still a relatively new platform. And as it's new, we recognize that it changes quite frequently in terms of whether it's going from Flow to Power Automate, or what the next name will be, we don't know. And then how it integrates with the different tools and different options that it gives you. There's a number of different kind of best practices that go with Power Automate that we'll get into. And I just want to give you guys the chance of putting these different things on top so you guys know what's going on, really. So that is me on the screen. Let me share back over. I wanted to run through this, and then ultimately I wanted to give you guys, and I'll give you some heads up warning now. I heard Power Automate just as I jumped in as Uday was finishing. Power Automate is kind of the no-code option that Microsoft gives to kind of go do anything. And when I say anything, I really do mean anything. There's a number of things out of the box that come and you say, oh, we want to just connect up to this. But as far as customizing and making your own components, you can go there. And I really haven't seen it not be able to trigger any number of things behind the scenes. So let me share back. And head through just to give you kind of an introduction to Power Automate, and then we'll go from there. Sound good? And please do think of your scenarios, and if you want to talk through them here, I'm more than happy to do that at the end. I wanted to give you some tips and tricks come the end, and then really leave it open, and hopefully we get a couple questions that we can kind of talk about real life things for you guys. So Power Automate, and this is kind of the Microsoft definition of it, really is just their cloud service for engaging all their different apps and services around the Microsoft world. Think anything in Azure that you want to trigger off and do. So one of the things that doesn't really come in this presentation, but when you think of Power Automate and you think of logic apps, if you've kind of come across that in the Azure world, they really are one and the same. I find the biggest difference between them is how they get paid for, whether it's piecemeal or by license. Power Automate being the licensed one, logic apps very much doing the same thing, but getting charged in a different fashion. They really do very, very 95% of the same things in doing that. So what you're really trying to do with Power Automate is kind of trigger some of the finer points of either an app, and I heard it referenced within CDS in how events happen, or when, in my case, as different ETL things happen and you want to load data into your system, Power Automate's a great way to kind of finish off those different ways of doing things. Microsoft being Microsoft in kind of being Office-centric, Office 365 and different things, they've also worked that into their way of approving requests and kind of managing process flows, which is what they try and keep incorporated with as they do their. So that is kind of how Microsoft defines Power Automate and what they wanted to use. And they've really done this so the platform can expand over time. So common scenarios that, again, Microsoft is looking to do, they lead off with their first one is automated approvals. They want people to approve in a corporate setting and doing different things. They want to trigger recurring processing. Now, this really comes into the data world. You always want to be loading your data and have the latest things in. So they're doing that. Again, process, but also they really want to be able to trigger from anywhere through a centralized location, where Power Automate is kind of a much better place to go look at what has happened than an event log on a server. It's kind of prettied up how logs look in terms of doing things. Let me go take that back for a second. And then they're also trying to move into their mobile side. So as they look into just regular mobile things, or even a Power App that's specific to a mobile user. So what does a flow look like? I'm not sure what the background of the audience is in general, but generally you're having a way to trigger a flow. And the product used to be called Flow, now it's called Power Automate, but both words are now, or both phrases are now pervasive throughout the entire set. They mean the same thing, but in a sense, you always want to have something that triggers it, and one of those things could be you clicking a button. And then any number of actions. This just says action 1 and action 2. Really, you can have an infinite number of actions. You can have up to, I think it's 7 different if statements and case statements that kind of allow you to go one direction or another. Think of process flow. But really, I haven't hit the limit on how big your actions can be. There are some limits that we'll get to in a second, but generally, you're pretty unlimited in terms of how intricate you can get. The pieces of flow that you guys need to know about is generally there's a trigger, and then after that, there's a next step. One of the things that Microsoft comes and says, hey, we want to be able to do this. We want you to be able to customize an email that goes and sends out. So this is kind of their next gen way of doing a mail merge on a Word document where you want to send it a mail, but it has everyone's name in it. It's a little bit rudimentary, and it requires a lot more process that kind of goes into doing different things. However, it does allow you to kind of get things done when you want to go do those things. So this is one of the things, and I think I heard you guys talking about this before. CDS is one of the most common triggers in Flow in terms of going to do customized things after the fact within your app or environment. So doing those things upon something getting created or upon a schedule or some other event in Azure or even outside of Azure, you can configure to go trigger a flow. So again, and this is one of the last slides I want to show that kind of says, hey, this is what Microsoft says it all can do with a pretty picture. They have a growing number of icons that come in that can be triggers and even actions within your flows. It really is true. You can do all these different things amongst all these different platforms. And when you find something it can't do, there's usually a custom way about going to do it. So that's a good thing. So we talked about just how does a general flow happen. It always starts with a trigger. It can do any number of actions. That really is a true statement. I'm one of the most frequent people to say, hey, Microsoft marketing loves to talk a big game, but in this case, they're actually true and they're not pushing anything that's really over and above. It really can do any number of things. And in the case where a single flow couldn't do it, you can link numbers and numbers of flows. So truly, this is a limitless thing. I mentioned before, you can have conditional logic. You absolutely can. You can base it on the inputs that you have. You can base it on inputs that then go pull live information as you go down your flow to pick and decide what to do without it. And then the call other workflows, that's really the way to kind of embed and use code repeatability. So you can have a number of things. I'm working on with Sumit and Samreen one engagement where we have 60 different trigger points, and each of those 60 different trigger points calls a common action to go happen. So pulling all those trigger points from all the different places that we want it to happen, it then centralizes and calls one thing. So we were able to code the one thing once, not have, if a change needs to be made, there's this code reusability aspect that's built into it, even though Microsoft would call it, hey, it's a no code environment. There is a little coding behind it. And some of the secrets to getting it to work really well are to go look within the code to make sure you've configured it as you expect. So I wanted to get into kind of some of my working using, in a lot of cases, Azure SQL, but really any database in general to kind of go trigger different flows. But before I do that, did anybody have any questions about kind of flow in general and its basic use and what it's used for? Okay, cool. I will get into this, and I wanted to talk here a little bit about when you're on a higher level and you're trying to design some of the flows and align them with databases. So one of the big things to go look at when you're designing and saying, hey, I want a flow to come in and do some work for me. One of the things you can do to trigger that flow is you can have custom code that goes and triggers things. So if you have an app where you're generating events that happen and you're logging those events, it makes total sense to have those events go trigger flow to go do things. One of the cases is if you find a problem with your app and how it triggers events or how it's storing data and you realize that it's wrong, one of the things you want to make sure you're designing for is that you can go correct that flaw. And this goes back to kind of your background. Are you an app person? Are you a data person? Or are you somewhere in the middle? One of the things you'll find is that if you can make your triggers as flexible as possible, that's one of the best things you can do. So if you are aligned to only be able to make changes to your flow trigger by having to go through some deployment process of code, that could hold your hands pretty tight in terms of wanting to do things. Sometimes when you're within a database, you could say, hey, look, I want to be able to send these 3 elements to my flow to go kick it off and have it go do something. And if you made a mistake in the content of one of those elements, in the database world, you can have some more flexibility about changing the data that goes into your flow, whereas in the code world, you would now have to go worry about your deployment and making sure you can make those changes in a hotfix style, which sometimes can be more risky. So it's worth designing the functions that trigger your flow to be flexible so you can make changes as you find different things in your environment. The second thing that Flow allows for with different database triggers that are those triggers, when you do that, you can use cloud databases, which is where Microsoft is certainly taking everything. They want everything to be within the cloud. That's not always the case especially for larger customers. They have old databases that will live and they want to modernize them, but they won't modernize them all in one shot. They'll say, oh, well, we don't want to change it, but we want the outputs, step 2, 3, and 4 from that original database to be able to go do things. So one of the advantages that Flow allows for is you can have an on-prem database and you can set up a gateway that will allow you to go trigger flows. And the flow will actually connect up to that on-prem database and be able to monitor it as if it were just the cloud. So setting up those gateways is something that Microsoft really sets up for and says, hey, look, we realize not everyone's going to be able to go do the gold standard of what we're recommending, but we'll give them a way to kind of crutch and Band-Aid to go get it. So Flow allows that, no code environment to get put on top of these really sometimes archaic systems that go do different things. And this last point is the deployment of changes you make to these data elements when you see them, one of the things that is optimal about Flow, and sometimes I wish this would happen a little quicker than it does, but Flow can automatically pick up these changes. It doesn't require you to go deploy your flow in a different way. Sometimes it just requires you to wait 10 or 15 minutes, but it can recognize changes and allow you to configure very quickly when things change, whether that's you've established a new table or a new column in a table that has information that you can go do. So does anybody have any questions about kind of flow design, kind of putting database in place of app? I'm pretty sure earlier on there was more of an app focus, but what those advantages are. Cool. All right, so the next thing was I wanted to get down and dirty, and I'm gonna go try and swap screens on you after I run through a number of these things. But one of the things using databases within the Power Platform is it allows you to have a database that kind of sits between environments. It actually doesn't technically live in any one environment. Whereas if you're using Dataverse or the Power Platform, it kind of sits within one environment, and you can point to different environments, but even across tenants, you have a hard time moving data between those two environments. So the database kind of allows for that middle ground, so you can have a stepping stone to jump from tenant to tenant or environment to environment, or both in some cases. So databases in line with Flow allow you to kind of get between the lines in terms of being able to do different things. So that's good. I think I mentioned this before, but allowing on-prem databases can trigger your cloud capabilities. Again, this allows you to align different things up. And I want to go show you how some of these work in the actual Flow. So one of the development limitations of Flow and how it works out of the box is when you go stick in a trigger, and SQL databases are one, but some of the frequencies that these fire when it fires these triggers is it's not constantly looking for an event to pop from a SQL database. And that makes sense because an old archaic database is not going to know to go fire an event and send it off somewhere. So how Flow works is on a recurring basis, and usually this is on a every 1 minute basis. I've seen it be sometimes every 3 minutes or 5 minutes or 10 minutes. Flow kicks off a SQL look to go say, hey, look, did you see anything new out there that I should care about and go do something with? One of the most common things that I use with a SQL is I say, hey, when a new row is created, go pull it through this flow. So if I add 10 rows to a database at any given time, that means I want the flow to go run 10 times virtually concurrently, and it all handles that. But one of the things that is really annoying is when you're trying to test out something, you're having to wait between 59 seconds and 1 second for this thing to kick off. One of the ways to get around that is not advertised. There's not a simple button that says, hey, run this now, run the check now, is in Flow. If you open up into edit mode, any flow, and you don't have to change anything, but then you just simply hit save, you'll see that the trigger of time goes and kicks off right away. I wish they had a button that said, hey, perform my trigger check now to go do that, but they don't. The easiest way to do that is hit edit, hit save, and in 3 or 4 seconds, you can have your flow triggering off. So when you're running things either in volume, you want to run a bunch at a time and kick it off more frequently than 1 minute or 5 minutes. This is one way to do that. So talking about the limitations of Flow in terms of, okay, you can have a flow that can have 50 tasks going down the screen, and that's all great. One of the other things of how many tasks can I run, or how many flows can I run at a time, what we've found is that you really don't want to go over about 200 or 250 tasks of a single flow running at one time. One, it's really hard to monitor. Two, flow seems to hiccup on itself. And when it hiccups up on itself, what it does is it says, hey, I'm running too many things. I'm going to start running flows and just pause on them in the middle, which is annoying because there's not much you can do to unpause them. One of the things I've found is in designing flows, if you do the top number of steps, I guess whatever the first 5-10 steps that you do in a flow are, make the last couple steps the kind of committing steps where it either writes to a database or makes a new entry in the CDS, or do different things at the end. So that way, hey, a 10-step flow can run the first 7 steps. It really hasn't done anything that requires any cleanup. So if it does pause in the middle, you can hit cancel and resubmit, and that sometimes simply unlocks it. So Power Automate's really good at stopping itself from getting overwhelmed. It's not good at recovering. So the best thing you can do is make sure you have the systems in place to not send more than about 200 every minute, or 3 minutes or 5 minutes, depending on your frequency. So flow doesn't, take too much into its mouth that it can't chew without finishing. You'll save yourself time. Ultimately, if you send less, more frequently, you'll allow the flows to finish in 1 to 2 seconds. Boom, and then it's ready for the next batch that you send. But if you were to send all of them at once, it'll literally get hung up on itself. The other thing about flow, and this is really a specific SQL thing, is flow likes to run in a very, very cloud-centric mentality. If you've worked with databases and ETLs and you're loading tables that have millions and millions of records, sometimes that can't happen in a minute or two. Sometimes it takes 30 minutes because you have super wide columns, or super wide tables that have columns with large data types. When you run things in flow and you want to push the envelope of moving data from one place or transforming it in another, ensure that anything you want to run that kicks off an external process within SQL or other modules, make sure those things can finish in about a minute or less. The max is 2 minutes, and when that 2-minute max is hit, it's like closing a SQL query that's running. It just cancels it and stops and never finishes. So if you have something that loops through, make sure you're cutting it off so it doesn't, and make sure those elements can have the time, and that time is really 120 seconds, and then you're done. That's just a best practice that we found the hard way. Hey, we wanted to just go do these things. And sometimes they run long, and then once they get running on a recurrent basis, they run in 30 seconds and it's quick. If you architect it that way, just ensure that in order to get up to speed, make sure that doesn't take over a minute as a best practice. Sometimes things just tend to go long. So that's it. Last 2 things here, and I think I mentioned the very last one, but as you start to use SQL, one of the most annoying ways of getting going is it requires SQL tables to have an identity column in whatever table that you're using. The reason for that is Flow needs to know when it does a check, hey, what's the largest record that I've used? Boom, once I have that, I'll go look for anything bigger than that, and until I find it, I'm sitting at that number. That's both a good thing and a bad thing. The bad thing is if you go truncate that table and you had a seed level of 10, well, the first 10 records you insert next, now that you've truncated it, they just simply won't run. Flow won't recognize. It's not smart enough to say, oh, you resetted this. We need to start over. Flow will require you to kind of point it to a new location. or switch up your connection, basically making a new connection that can go do something to go do that work. So just be careful as you set things up, because Flow is very particular in how it manages the different data coming through its tables. And then last thing, I think I mentioned this before, when Flow kind of hits some of these issues of concurrency, or you're running so many things that you may exceed a limit that your licenses prevent, swapping over and using the same setup you had in Power Automate, but in Logic apps, allows you to kind of hit those marks with really no changing capability, really just changing how you're paying for all the different runs that you're doing. So that's good there. So does anybody have any questions, kind of what we've been talking about here? Cool. So what I'm going to do is end this. Cool. And I wanted to bring this over. So this is what a typical flow when you make a SQL-based trigger will look like. You'll have to go say, hey, you'll configure a server and a database name, and then you'll go pick a table that you'll go see here. And when you pick that table, you can pick one that's dynamic, so you can have it, or you can just pick a table from your set. I don't generally like to use the different filter queries in these advanced option sets, only because you can just embed those into the logic that goes into your table. And if you do have that logic, I would encourage you to kind of make that logic within a SQL view that looks on top of a table, rather than using these specific things. These are options like filter and top and order that are much more user needed when you're querying CDS and different things there. SQL provides you those capabilities kind of behind the scenes, and I would encourage you to use them there, just because it ultimately gives you more flexibility. But one of the things is when you go create these flows and you want to go do things, sometimes the no codeness that Power Automate's trying to push makes it too easy to make a mistake. So one of the keys that I wanted to show you guys is make sure when you're doing this, you're going and looking at this ellipsis worth of different things. So settings and peak code are definitely your friends. So this retry policy, I always like to come in and set this to none. That way, if it fails right away, and you're done in a couple of seconds if there's a failure. If you leave it on default, the default is set to 4. What that means is it's going to wait a minute, and you'll end up waiting basically the time to error out plus 3 minutes for this thing to finally fully error out, right? Which is annoying if it's just going to fail 3 times and you're testing something. I like to set it to none, so it just dies right away, and then we can go fix the issue rather than waiting on it. The other thing here is peak code. So here, what you're looking at here is the details of anything. And this goes for not just the trigger, but for any other step that you go put in here. So if I wanted to go put a step that was, let's just say common data service, I want to go create a new row. And I want to go pick something. I want to go add an account, right? This is one of the things where I can go see, hey, the entity name is accounts. Now, that makes a lot of sense that this is account and this is accounts. Sometimes you can have entity names or table names that are named the same in the user-friendly name, but they're completely different on the back end. And there's really no way to tell from the drop down that you're picking from. you have to pick and then go see what the actual entity name is behind the scenes. So the peek code is certainly your friend as you go start to do that and look into making sure you're setting up the right thing in validating the code that you actually have. This is one of the things where they say it's no code. However, there's definitely code running behind the scenes, and sometimes being able to go look at that and see that with your two eyes helps a whole heck of a lot. When visually the interface is always changing, and you may have different field names and different things that you may not know exactly what they represent. So that's a good thing there. Cool. And then the last thing that I wanted to kind of show you guys, and this is one of the things here. So one of the most performant ways of working with CDS, and this is one of the things that we've found really scales flow and makes it work 5 times as fast as it normally would. I'm signed into Common Data Service just through my normal Active Directory account, right? But if you actually go into Azure and set up access to whatever environment, Power Apps environment you're working in, and you go set it up so you can connect with the service principal, the interface in working with CDS, and this is aside from any SQL, acts to pull data and create data and update data. Just general rule, 5 times as fast as if you had just a normal login person. So one of those things is, hey, if you're truly needing to run this and do more than a handful of 1,000 updates or something, that's a point where you want to say, hey, we should go connect with the service principal, really just for operational efficiency and making sure that you can push those things in. So that is there. I think I only have about 5 minutes left, so I wanted to certainly give time for any questions you guys had, and any examples you wanted to run by and saying, hey, I'm trying to do this, how should we kick it? So I'll open up the floor to any questions, and otherwise I'll pass the floor back. Yep. Cool. I will hang out for another 5 or 10 minutes and see if anything comes across. I'm happy to answer, and I will stick my email address and contact info into the chat, and we'll be happy to answer any questions in the coming days or weeks. Awesome. Thank you, guys.
Hi, this is Ashish. I have a question.
Sure.
I'm particularly new to Power Platform and to Power Automate. Maybe this is something easy, but I was trying and I approached the community as well. I couldn't find really what I was looking for. I am trying to create a flow, and in that flow, the first step is when an item is created or modified in SharePoint list, it should call the user information table that's there. And when it calls the user information table, it should find the ID for the user who is actually creating or modifying the item. And the next step is it should update that very item in that SharePoint list with the ID that it found in the SharePoint table. I mean, the user information table. And this is very simple. I apologize. I couldn't do it. I tried. I wasn't able to stamp that ID.
So you're trying to find the ID and then update it over top of what field? Is it just a list of user? Or
it is basically a column. Or? It's a person and group column. So yeah. And
it's not like a modified by column, which is kind of mandated under some control with SharePoint. So
to simplify, we can say that a person who's creating any item in the list pick up the ID from the user information table and just stamp the ID to the item that the person created. So That's simple.
And you're able to capture that ID, yeah?
Yes. So yes, I am able to capture that ID.
Okay. My thinking is that it's looking for maybe not the ID. It's trying to make it simple for you, in that it's trying to look at, it's trying to allow you to provide the name behind the scenes, because sometimes users, I haven't done it specifically in SharePoint before, but I know in trying to do it in Dynamics, it actually in one case wanted the domain user. So it might be worth trying another identifier of the user you're trying to put in there,
Well,
rather than
yeah,
the ID.
to see, so when the flow runs, you can see the output, what it actually captures or what it has bought. So when I'm checking that, I do see that ID in there, because I'm using a OData filter query to modify what needs to be picked from the user information table. And it's just that I'm not able to stamp. That's the only issue. I'm able to call what I need.
Okay.
Sorry, go ahead.
I mean, my thinking of the ways I would go to debug it, because I haven't done it specifically in SharePoint, but I've done it to Dynamics and I've done it with Azure DevOps, all of which are kind of newer platforms. So
okay,
there's your grain of salt. Is try and do, rather than do the update, have you pulled the record in Flow and kind of just, gotten the record and seen what the output is, and see if in fact is the ID embedded within that record, or is it some other identifier for the user that you're trying to overwrite? And I would copy the format with what they're doing. That's kind of how I would figure it out.
Okay.
If that makes sense.
Yeah, I'll try it. I'll try that. Yep.
Okay. And if you can, I'll toss my contact information in the chat.
Sure, that'll be great. Yeah, we can connect offline.
You're welcome to email me and I'll get back to you.
All right. Thank you.
Awesome.
I think this is the end of the session. If there's any further questions.
All right.
So yeah, thank you so much, Ted, for your very insightful session. Yeah, really appreciate it.
Very good, guys. Thank you much. Bye.
Bye.